happens when we don't follow through in that process. In other words, the writer learned how to play the piano by listening to his mother. His mother recognized that he had this skill, and she began getting him a teacher to train. Now, he's learning to play the piano, and all this time, as a young child, he grows up without a concept of race. He thought he was white. He was light-skinned. He moved to Connecticut. It was a racially integrated society, so he went to a school that was integrated. So the idea that he was any less was foreign to him. And he actually talks about it at the end of the first chapter. He talks about how he came into his awareness of being black. In essence, he had a school administrator came into the classroom one day, was talking to the teacher, and the school administrator asked all the white children to stand up. So he stood up just like everyone else. And the teacher told him, no. You sit down. And he was at a loss. He didn't understand why she was telling him to sit down. I'm sorry.
So what would be the difference between a person purposely passing for a different race versus a person just being naive? And when I say naive, I don't mean in his context like deliberately, but naive as in not being exposed to that particular race.
Well, I think the difference between the two, one is age. We live in a society in which if you don't know who you are, you're going to be told who you are eventually.
Exactly.
You just got to keep living. And so for him, his younger years, he wasn't exposed to that conversation.
Yeah.
So he had no concept of race. I can tell you when I recognized distinctly the difference, and I was 5 years old. I'll never forget this. I was in kindergarten, went to a birthday party, and I was the only black child at the birthday party. And I became conscious of that fact, not because I looked around and I noticed that everyone was a different color, but because one of the children's mother said something, out of place in terms of her not wanting her child to play with me.
Yeah.
And so that was how I was introduced to the concept of race. Honestly, and they've done studies. If you take two children of different racial makeups and you allow them to grow up within a bubble in which we as adults don't project our stereotypes, our preconceived notions on them, they will grow up just admiring, respecting, and loving and caring for each other as individuals. So we become conscious of race as it relates to our role in society. Just as the writer only became conscious of race when he was shunned, for lack of a better term, or he interpreted as being shunned. Because on his way home that same day, he was taunted by the white kids who all of a sudden said, hey, we thought something was funny about you. We thought you looked a little different. And so he began to internalize that. Now he's questioning who he is. Never questioned who he was beforehand. Never thought about being inferior beforehand. I'm sorry, yes, sir.
Is this a time when we can interact?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh, really? Okay, well, on that issue, it just strikes me as a very peculiar definition for America. Actually, when the first magazine of Life magazine was published, in there was a photograph from Brazil, and under that photograph it says if you have one drop of white blood, you're white. All right? And by contrast, if you have one drop of black blood, you're black. And here, let's say if you're Irish or whatever, and most of us, the heritage is mixed.
Yes, sir.
Right? I mean, even the black folk, you said, you got to be kidding. I mean, almost none of us can say, well, everybody was black in my family. So now that's a joke, mate.
No.
Okay. Yeah, of course. No.
But that's real.
I'm being facetious.
Yeah.
No, but that's real.
Yeah. And you say, well, how can you say that this one is just black? It's like saying to a child, you can only claim one side of your heritage.
Yes, sir.
Right? You can't pay respect to your grandmother, your great grandparents on the other side.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Right? Even Kunta Kinte had to, was up against it.
Yes, sir.
And I think, we've got a grandchild, who was just coming back from Europe, and she's saying, I've just discovered who I am. I'm European. There are many people like me there. Okay? And it's like, oh, which group are you with? Who are your whatever. But anyway, I hate the definition, the American definition of who we are.
No, absolutely. But and I did not bring it here today, but actually I have a newspaper from 1857 in Ohio, Supreme Court decision that determined anything, if it could be determined that as little as 1/16 of your blood was African American, you were considered black. Now, what makes the United States unique in this situation is that our racial dynamic is largely tied to economics. Because the importance of determining racial makeup only becomes a factor when it came to determining a slave status. So there's an economic value tied to that. And if you could think about it in modern day terms, if I could prove that she had 1/16 blood, that was the difference between me owning her or her being free. So I have a vested economic interest in her and proving that she has that black blood so that I can keep her as a slave. Okay.
But during that time, how would you do that if we were classified as property?
Well, see, that was the thing. The laws that determine free and slave status evolved state by state over time. So that's a conception that we tend to forget about. States like we talked about last month with Sojourner Truth. New York did not outlaw slavery until 1828. So we talk about slavery as a Southern concept, but New York had only freed its slaves less than 35 years before the Civil War anyway. Basically one generation before the Civil War started. So you still had states in the North that held on to slavery, but the only reason why those states outlawed slavery is because it wasn't in their economic interest to keep it. This is why slavery was allowed in the South but wasn't allowed in the North. This wasn't this great moral dilemma that people fought over. We have to be honest with ourselves. Now it's nice for those who want to embrace this perfect vision of America and want to gloss over America's history to look at it simply as the Civil War was fought to free the slaves. No, it was always about economic interest and who sought to gain what. Because ultimately the North was dependent upon Southern slave labor because the North was the manufacturer of a lot of the material, the textile industry in Boston or in states like Massachusetts were relying on the cotton that was grown in the South. And so they had a vested interest in making sure that slavery was perpetuated, or at least the fruits of that labor were perpetuated. And it was only when the South threatened to separate itself and its economic interest from the North that slavery became a problem that had to be fixed. And so this idea that America has ever been about the best interests of all people is laughable at best and naive at worst. And so we are looking at, and James Weldon Johnson, we got to understand how well-rounded of an individual James Weldon Johnson was to be able to fully understand the implications of this book. He wrote this book as someone that had traveled not only the United States but around the world. That was not only was he a musician, a writer, he was a novelist, he was a poet, he was a lawyer, he was a diplomat, in addition to being a civil rights activist. So we're talking about these Renaissance men that formed the backbone of the Harlem Renaissance, and James Weldon Johnson was certainly one of them. These were well-rounded men so when he's writing this book, again, he's writing after having rubbed elbows with W.E.B. Du Bois and Walter White. He's speaking after interacting directly with people like Carter G. Woodson. He's speaking after, again, like I said, having traveled all throughout the South. And in fact, when he wrote this book, he wrote the Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man while he was in Nicaragua. So this was a man that was well-traveled, well-versed. And so when he's speaking on this racial dynamic, he's speaking on it after having not only experienced life in the South, having grown up in the South, but having experience traveling to Europe, South America, traveling throughout the North, and eventually, because he becomes a professor at Fisk University, which is why we brought some items from Fisk University, he went there to further build on his musical skills. And I kind of want to apologize for kind of dancing all over the place here, but I wanted to provide that historical context for James Weldon Johnson to add to the fact that all of these experiences were indirectly told as elements of the story in the book. The musical element, the main character, the writer, he was a musician and he played the piano. James Weldon Johnson was a musician and a composer. His brother was a better piano player, John Johnson, but they both played the piano, so he's speaking from personal experience. In the book, the writer learns how to play the piano indirectly from his mother. James Weldon Johnson's mother was a musician and a piano player. The character ends up going through school, and he introduces us to two friends that he has. One white friend named Red, or he was Redhead, but he shortened it to Red, and a black friend named Shiny. Now think about those names. White friend named Redhead, black friend named Shiny. So when he's giving characters names, he's giving characters names to describe or to try to put them, to make them symbols. Redhead was a symbol of the white race in general. Shiny,
Yeah.
speaks for itself.
Right.
And but you also have to keep in mind that even in and of itself had a double meaning. Because on the one hand, while using the term shine was an insult for African Americans, he says shiny. In other words, someone that is shiny. And what you will find is Shiny was actually the smartest person in the class. In this class, this racially integrated class, Shiny was the valedictorian. He was the smartest individual. So while on the one hand, calling someone a shine was an insult, James Weldon Johnson was able to flip that on its head, and his nickname actually referred to the fact that he was brilliant. In other words, James Weldon Johnson was showing us what we've always done, which is we get lemons and we make lemonade.
Hello.
We always learn how to make something out of nothing. And in Shiny, what we see as a character, as it develops throughout the book, we see him early on. He's the class valedictorian, and he actually is the one that gives the writer his first sense of black pride. And that's important because the writer, when he found out that he was African American, or when it first was found out that he was black, he went home and he asked his mother. He was like, "Hey, Mom, I was at school today, and I went to stand up with all the other white kids, and teacher told me to sit down. Mommy, am I not white? Are you white?" Because his mother was very fair-skinned, and again, they had never been, he didn't recall them being discriminated against, so he didn't have this history of bias to know that he was black. And rather than embrace the blackness, instead his mother told him, "No, I'm not white. But your dad was one of the best men of the South. So you have some of the best of the white blood in you." So in other words, rather than reinforcing a love of who he was, she tried to get him, or she tried to hold on to the whiteness, which formed in him this identity crisis. Because on the one hand, you're telling me that I should love myself, but you're not telling me to love you and love the blackness within you. Love those things about you that were natural. And so all the things that he picked up from her, he picked up from the black side. The rhythm, the music, the passion for music. All of these things he picked up from her, but in essence, she was denying herself. And so this self-loathing is what actually contributes to his conflict. So he grows up feeling like he's in this no man's land. And so in school, he becomes isolated. He only hangs out with Red and occasionally Shiny. And the only reason why he hangs out with Red is because Red just wouldn't leave him alone. Red was loyal. And so when they get older and it's time for them to graduate from high school and move on in life, and I'm sorry, let me rewind a little bit. He and Red were close. One of the reasons why Red was so loyal and held on is our writer was pretty smart. And Red wasn't the best of students in school. And so our writer would often do his homework for him. And so he went from helping him little bit by little bit to just, forget, I'll just do your work for you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Red was symbolic or emblematic of the white race in general. And so this relationship between Red and our writer was basically a microcosm of the slave experience. The writer did his work for him. And because the writer did his work for him, they had this mutually beneficial relationship. Red every now and then would carry his books for him. He would do little things. He would try to protect him. And in exchange, our writer would do his work for him. Now, when they got older and they were graduating and getting ready to leave high school, Red just said, you know what, I want to get into banking. And he was just able to do it. He didn't have to go to college. He didn't have to study. He didn't have to do anything extra. We've already shown that he wasn't the highest or the most intellectual, didn't have the best scholastic record, but he was able to just get into banking. And James Weldon Johnson demonstrates that in the book because he's trying to articulate for the audience the difference between the path to success for white students, the path to success for black students. And so Shiny, even though he was class valedictorian, had to scrape together 2 jobs to get enough money to be able to go to a college. He had to travel to the South to get a degree at an HBCU. Our writer had, and keep in mind, his father tried to support him and would send money and send gifts and every now and then, but his father wanted him to go to Harvard. However, the writer, his mother wanted him to go to Atlanta University. And so he chose to go to Atlanta University, primarily not only because that's where his mother wanted him to go, but because he didn't have the finances to go to Harvard. And so, again, James Weldon Johnson articulates this to us to draw this distinction between options that were available for a black man coming out of high school versus anyone else. Everyone else seemed to have an easier path than the black man. And I mention black man only because he wrote as a man. So I don't want to try to act as if he was speaking from a woman's perspective when he wasn't and when he didn't. Now, when he spoke from a woman's perspective, he spoke through the lens of his mother. And he spoke through the lens of his mother as a woman who was conflicted with who she was. And there's a scene in the book in chapter 2 where he meets his dad. And I really suggest, I strongly advise everyone to make sure that you read that second chapter, because even though it was written in 1912, it could have been written yesterday. When you talk about the experience of growing up in a single parent home and all of a sudden this man calling himself your dad but has never been in your life shows up at the door. You come, and it's kind of funny because he talks about this story in a way that I'm sure a lot of people can relate. He was a black man, a young black student. He was the head of his household. Even though he was the only child, and he was only a child, he was still the man of the house. So he comes home and he distinctly writes, he went to put his hat on his hole, on his peg on the wall, and it was already a hat there. And he like,
what the problem is?
He coming to peek.
Nice hat either.
No, he was coming to peek around. He was trying to figure out. And so he turns the corner. He sees this man that kind of looks like him, but he can't. There's no instant connection, but he knows there's something to him. And this is an experience that a lot of us can relate to that have grown up in single parent homes. Now, I was blessed to have my mother and father in my home, so I'm not going to try to sit here and try to project something I'm not. At the same time, his story is a story that a lot of people can relate to growing up in single parent homes. And so he talks about that distance that is there between him and this man. And in fact, he was trying, even though this is his father that he had been asking his mother for information on, when he saw him, he couldn't wait to get away from him. The writer. He just wanted to go about his day. And so I only relay that part of the story to show us that when we talked about the miseducation of the Negro, and Carter G. Woodson told us that we have the greatest stories within our own community. We don't need to admire anyone else. We don't need to imitate anyone else. We just need to look at ourselves and look at our own stories.